Good evening, and welcome to the Sleep to Law series. Tonight, we'll talk about the Green Mile, a story that takes place in the haunting E-block of Cold Mountain Penitentiary during the Great Depression. If you'd like, subscribe or comment to support our journey into the darkness. Before we begin, I have a question for you. If you possessed the supernatural power to heal others, but knew that using it would cause physical damage to yourself, would you still choose to help them? Comment below with your thoughts. As we open the files on Cold Mountain Penitentiary, I want to invite you to become a part of this channel's foundation. As a new channel, every member who joins is helping to build this library of lore from the ground up. If you want to support these deep dives, click the join button below. Now, let the execution begin. Introduction. The story of the Green Mile didn't begin on a printed page, but in the restless waking hours of the night. It was born from insomnia, that hollow state where the mind refuses to shut down, spinning tales to bridge the gap between darkness and dawn. The author originally conceived a narrative about a magician on death row, a trickster performing sleight of hand before his final curtain call. But stories, like living things, evolve. The magician faded, replaced by something heavier, more elemental. A healer, a man of immense size but simple mind, condemned for a crime he perhaps tried to undo rather than commit. This narrative wasn't just about the mechanics of execution, but about myth-making in the Depression-era South. It was a story written in a frenzy, released in installments like the Victorian serials of Dickens, a high-wire act of storytelling, where the author himself wasn't always sure where the next step would land. Part 1. Chapter 1. The year is 1932. The setting is the Cold Mountain Penitentiary, a place where the heat of the Deep South seems to bake the misery right into the brickwork. At the heart of this facility sat the electric chair. The inmates, using humor as a shield against their terrifying reality, christened it Old Sparky or the Big Juicy. They joked about the warden's power bill, a desperate attempt to trivialize the wooden throne that waited to stop their hearts. Paul Edgecombe, the block superintendent, oversaw 78 executions during his tenure. He understood that the jokes stopped the moment the ankles were clamped to the oak legs. That was the moment of realization. The knowledge that while blood still pumped and muscles still flexed, the body was already finished. To spare the guards the sight of that final, soul-crushing realization in a condemned man's eyes, a black silk bag was always placed over the prisoner's head. It was a mercy for the executioners, not the executed. This drama played out in E-block. Unlike the rest of the prison, E-block was brick rather than wood, covered by a metal roof that magnified the summer sun like a magnifying glass on an anthill. It contained 6 oversized cells, though they were rarely full. This was the holding pen for the walking dead. The corridor running down the center was covered in linoleum the color of crushed old limes. In other prisons, the final walk was called the last mile. At Cold Mountain, because of that faded floor, they called it the Green Mile. The geography of the mile was simple and stark. A left turn at the T-junction meant the exercise yard. Life, of a sort. A right turn led through Paul Edgecombe's office and into a storage shed. This shed was a place of jarring duality. On one side, it held the tools of life: seeds for spring planting, shovels, lime for the baseball field. On the other side stood the chair. Old Sparky sat on a platform, its cap often hanging jauntily on the backrest, a sponge sitting in a bucket nearby, waiting to be soaked in brine to better conduct the lethal current into a human brain. It was a space where the mundane supplies of prison maintenance sat in silent conversation with the instrument of state-sanctioned death. Chapter 2. The autumn of 1932 was blistering, a relentless heat that mirrored the physical discomfort plaguing Paul Edgecombe, who was suffering from a severe urinary infection. It was a private agony that made every movement a trial, serving as a visceral parallel to the moral irritation of his profession. This was the season John Coffey arrived. The transfer was orchestrated by Percy Wetmore, a guard who was the antithesis of Paul. Percy was small, cruel, and employed only because of his family connections to the governor. He revelled in the power he held over caged men. When he ushered John Coffey onto the block, he did so with the theatrical mocking cry of "dead man walking," parading the prisoner like a trophy. John Coffey was an anomaly of nature. He stood 6 feet, 8 inches tall, a behemoth of a man with a chest like a barrel and muscles that strained against his oversized denim uniform. Chains draped over him like jewelry on a giant, clinking with every shuffle. Yet the physical threat of his size was instantly undercut by his demeanor. He didn't look like a hardened killer. He looked like a lost child. His eyes weren't dull, but distant, filled with a bewildered sorrow, like a creature that had been broken by the world. Paul, despite his physical pain and the oppressive heat, asserted control, sending the sadistic Percy away to handle menial labor. This left Paul alone with the giant. As the chains were removed, Coffey remained docile, exhibiting a gentle compliance that unnerved the guards more than aggression would have. When Paul went through the standard intake speech, the rules of the block, the radio privileges, the visitation rights, Coffey listened with a kind of simple intensity. He revealed he could spell only his name, like the drink, only not spelled the same. But the true subversion of the monster archetype came when Paul prepared to leave. The giant, condemned for a double murder of unspeakable brutality, asked a question that belonged in a nursery, not a death house. Do you leave a light on after bedtime? He was afraid of the dark. This admission cracked the facade of the cold-blooded killer. Paul, moved by a strange instinct, shook the man's hand, a massive paw that engulfed his own. As Paul left, Coffey sat on his bunk, head bowed, and whispered the words that would haunt the entirety of his stay. I couldn't help it. I tried to take it back, but it was too late. Chapter 3. The arrival of John Coffey sent a ripple of unease through the staff of E-Block. Back in the office, Paul and his trusted guards, Brutal Howell and Dean Stanton, discussed the new inmate. The disconnect between Coffey's terrifying size and his weeping, childlike vulnerability was impossible to ignore. Percy, of course, saw only a lagoon, a target for his petty malice, but Paul needed to understand the contradiction. Paul decided to investigate the background of his new charge. He made his way to the prison library, a stifling clapboard box of a building that smelled of old paper and the nearby latrines. The heat inside was nearly unbearable, exacerbating Paul's infection, a throbbing reminder of the sickness in his own body, matching the sickness in the files he was about to read. There, amidst the stacks of newspapers, he reconstructed the tragedy that had brought John Coffey to the Green Mile. The details of the Decay twins' murder were not just crimes. They were nightmares that had bled into reality. Chapter 4. The events had unfolded in June, on a cotton farm owned by Klaus Detterick. It was a time when the Depression had humbled the South, but the Dettericks were getting by. They had a son, Howard, and 9-year-old twin daughters, Cora and Kathy. On a warm night, the girls had been allowed to sleep on the screened porch, a treat that would become a tragedy. In the morning, the girls were gone. The screen door was torn from its hinges, and blood speckled the porch. The family dog, a large collie, lay dead behind the barn with its neck snapped, silenced by a treat before violence was visited upon it. The search began immediately. Klaus and his son Howard, armed and frantic, followed a trail of blood and torn fabric, pieces of a nightgown, a scrap of shorts, leading toward the woods. The local sheriff, a man more interested in comfort than competence, eventually organized a posse with dogs. The tracking hounds led the men through the scrub pine and toward the Trapingus River. The heat was rising, the insects were swarming, and the dread was heavy in the air. When they found the end of the trail, it wasn't a sight of struggle, but of aftermath. They heard a sound first, not a baying dog, but a human howl. It was a sound of raw, primal anguish. There, on the riverbank, sat John Coffey. He was barefoot, massive, rocking back and forth. In his colossal arms, he cradled the bodies of the two little girls. Their blonde hair was matted with blood, their skulls crushed. Coffey was weeping, his face slick with tears, howling at the sky while the posse froze in horror. The father, Klaus, attacked the giant in a blind rage, kicking and beating him, but Coffey barely seemed to register the blows. He was lost in a grief that seemed too vast for his simple mind to process. When the deputy finally approached him, demanding answers, Coffey didn't confess in the traditional sense. He didn't boast of the kill. He looked at the lawman with eyes that seemed ancient and weeping, and said the same thing he would later tell Paul Edgecombe in his cell. "I couldn't help it. I tried to take it back, but it was too late." The posse found a lunch in his pocket, a sandwich and a pickle wrapped in newspaper, evidence of a drifter's meager existence. They saw a monster caught red-handed with his prey. They didn't see the ambiguity in his words. To them, "I tried to take it back," was the gibberish of a madman. They arrested him, spat in his face, and the machinery of justice moved with swift, unthinking efficiency. The trial was a formality. The jury needed only 45 minutes to decide that the weeping giant should burn. Chapter 5. Paul sat in the sweltering library, absorbing the horror of the newspaper accounts. The image of the giant black man holding the broken white children was a picture of absolute guilt to anyone who looked at the surface. Yet, Paul had met the man. He had seen the fear of the dark. He had felt the strange, gentle electricity in Coffey's hand. The dissonance between the savage crime and the gentle, simple soul sitting in E-block was a puzzle that wouldn't align. That night, sleep was impossible for Paul. The physical agony of his infection flared up, burning like coal oil, keeping him pacing the floors of his home. His wife, sensing his distress, offered comfort, but Paul kept the details of the prison to himself. He stood on his back porch, staring into the dark, unable to shake the vision of the events at the riverbank. The official story said monster. His gut said mystery. The Green Mile had claimed many men, but John Coffey was different. As Paul finally drifted into a fitful, pain-racked sleep, he dreamed not of the electric chair, but of two little girls with blood in their hair, and the weeping giant who had tried in vain to take it back. Chapter 6. The morning following the incident with Percy Wetmore brought the inevitable summons. A pink slip waited on my desk, a silent command to report to Warden Moores. In the rigid hierarchy of Cold Mountain Penitentiary, there were unwritten rules to the game, rules of deference and politics, and I had broken them by challenging the governor's nephew. I delayed the meeting as long as I could, occupying myself with the mundane rituals of the mile. The heat was already rising, a stifling wet blanket that made the air feel heavy and used. I reviewed the night logs, finding nothing but the quiet sorrow of Edouard Delacroix, our Cajun inmate, who had wept himself to sleep. The log noted that Delacroix found comfort only in his new companion, a mouse named Mr. Jingles, who slept in a cigar box or curled upon the inmate's stomach. It was a strange mercy. God had seemingly decided that a rat of a man like Delacroix deserved a mouse for a guardian angel. When I finally entered Warden Moore's office, the dynamic shifted. Hal Moores was a good man trapped in a grim profession, a man of integrity navigating the treacherous waters of state politics. But on this morning, the warden was not the figure of authority. He was a husband terrified by the frailty of his wife, Melinda. The conversation began not with a reprimand, but with a confession of vulnerability. Melinda was suffering from blinding headaches and a trembling weakness in her hand. In 1932, diagnostic medicine was a dark room. They feared a stroke or worse, a tumor. A death sentence as sure as any signed by a judge. There is a specific kind of helplessness that strikes men used to being in control when they face an enemy they cannot lock away, and I saw that fear in Hal's eyes. But the machinery of the prison had to turn. Moores shifted the topic to Percy Wetmore. The political pressure was real. Percy had run tattletale to his connections at the state capital. However, Moores offered a solution, a bargain struck with the devil. Percy had applied for a transfer to Briar Ridge, a state mental hospital where the work was administrative and the pay better. The catch? Percy wanted to lead an execution before he left. He wanted to stand front and center when Delacroix rode the lightning. It was a grotesque request, born of a morbid curiosity to see death up close, to smell the burning flesh. Moores knew it, and I knew it. We were gambling with the dignity of a condemned man's final moments, betting that we could control Percy long enough to be rid of him forever. I agreed to the terms. If putting Percy out front for Delacroix meant extracting his poison from the Green Mile permanently, I would take that bet. We were trading a moment of horror for a future of peace. Chapter 7. Before the darkness of executions took center stage, there was the mouse. The arrival of Mr. Jingles, originally dubbed Steamboat Willie by the guards, was an anomaly in the sterile, death-haunted environment of E-Block. He appeared one evening while Brutal and Dean Stanton were manning the desk, a tiny brown scrap of life moving with peculiar intelligence. This was no ordinary rodent scurrying for crumbs. The mouse moved with the precision of a guard conducting rounds. It stopped at the empty cells, peering in, checking the perimeter, before boldly approaching the duty desk where the giants in blue uniforms sat. There is a psychological absurdity to finding joy on death row, but when Brutal offered the mouse a piece of his corned beef sandwich, and the creature sat up to eat it with the manners of a gentleman, the tension on the mile broke. Even Arlen Bitterbuck, the Washita elder waiting for his date with the chair, watched with amusement from his cell. In a place designed to strip men of their humanity before killing them, this mouse became a strange shared secret, a spark of innocence in a concrete tomb. Brutal, in a moment of whimsical rebellion against the rigid regulations that Percy Wetmore held so dear, pulled out the official visitor's log. In the ledger meant for lawyers, priests, and weeping relatives, he inscribed Steamboat Willie into the permanent record. It was a dangerous joke. If Percy had seen it, the political fallout would have been immediate, but it was also an act of defiance, a way for Brutal to assert that life, no matter how small, had value here. The mouse, however, was elusive. When Brutal and I searched the restraint room later that night, intending, with the grim practicality of our profession, to exterminate it before it could breed, we found nothing. The room, padded with canvas for the safety of the mad, offered no visible exit. The drain was meshed. The walls were seamless. The mouse had vanished as mysteriously as it had arrived, leaving us to wonder if we had all shared a hallucination born of the heat and the stress. But the mouse was real, and it was the first thread in a tapestry of supernatural events that would unravel our understanding of the world that autumn. Chapter 8. Looking back is a treacherous business, especially when the memories are colored by the ghosts of the men we killed. Months after these events, long after the tragedies had played out, Brutal and I found ourselves back in that restraint room. By then, the bluster was gone from Brutal. The job was eroding his soul, chipping away at him one execution at a time. He led me up a stepladder to inspect the heavy ceiling beams. There, in a small joint where the wood came together, was a hole no larger than a coin, and from that dark recess drifted a scent that had no business in a prison, the smell of peppermint candy. It was the smell of Delacroix, and the smell of the impossible. Inside the hole, we found the remnants of a colored wooden spool, the very toy Delacroix had used to play with Mr. Jingles. The wood had been gnawed into splinters, arranged like a shrine or a memory. The realization hit us with the force of a physical blow. The mouse had not just been surviving, It had been mourning. It had dragged these tokens of its master to a high, safe place. Standing on that ladder, the wind howling outside like a lost soul, the emotional dam broke for Brutal. He confessed a childhood memory of feeling small and insignificant, of needing a token of comfort to survive a harsh world. He saw himself in that mouse, and in the condemned men. The line between the guards and the guarded had blurred too much. We made a pact then, in the quiet aftermath of the supernatural. We would finish the job with John Coffey, and then we would walk away. We would not kill again. The Green Mile takes a piece of you every time you flip the switch, and we were running out of pieces to give. Part 2. Chapter 1. I am writing this from the solarium of Georgia Pines, a nursing home that serves as my final waiting room. It is a different kind of Green Mile, lined with linoleum instead of lime-colored floorboards. But the smell of impending death is the same. The years have turned me into a relic, an old man surrounded by the wreckage of minds lost to dementia. But my memory remains sharp, a curse that forces me to relive 1932 while the world around me forgets what it had for breakfast. Here, in this sterile purgatory, I am tormented by Brad Dolan, an attendant who is the spiritual twin of Percy Wetmore. Evil, it seems, does not die. It just changes faces. Brad has the same cruel smirk, the same casual sadism, the same belief that he is the center of the universe. He reads trashy joke books and mocks the infirmities of the patients, calling Alzheimer's AIDS for old people. He is a reminder that the petty malice I witnessed on the mile is a permanent feature of the human condition. Brad's presence serves as a bridge between the past and the present. He forces me to remember why we hated Percy so much. It wasn't just that Percy was cruel, it was that he was unsafe. On the mile, stability is life. You need to know that the man standing behind you with a baton is steady. Percy was a grenade with a loose pin. And Brad Dolan is a reminder that I am still trapped in a world run by careless, cruel men. I take refuge in my writing, retreating to 1932, to the time before John Coffey, when the only mystery we had to solve was a mouse. Chapter 2. Back in the sweltering summer of 32, the conflict between Percy and the mouse escalated into a battle of wills that exposed the depth of Percy's inadequacy. The mouse returned, bold as ever, inspecting the block while the president, a white-collar criminal named Arthur Flanders, watched from his cell. Percy, leaning against the doorframe, hated the creature instantly. His hatred wasn't rational. It was the reaction of a bully who cannot abide anything he cannot control. The mouse ignored him, accepting food from Dean Stanton and Bill Dodge with that uncanny, human-like gratitude. To Percy, this was an insult. He saw the inmates and the mouse as a collective mockery of his authority. When the mouse ignored a cracker thrown by Bill Dodge, only to accept one from Dean, it felt like a judgment. The mouse knew who the safe men were. Enraged, Percy drew his heavy hickory baton and hurled it with lethal intent. It was a vicious athletic throw, one that should have crushed the small creature. But Mr. Jingles possessed reflexes that bordered on the supernatural. He actually ducked, and the baton clattered uselessly against the bars. Percy's subsequent tantrum chasing the mouse toward the restraint room was a display of impotent rage. He stomped and cursed, trying to crush the life out of something simply because it defied him. Dean Stanton, usually the mildest of us, had to restrain himself from physically attacking Percy. Later, Dean tried to mentor the governor's nephew, offering a piece of wisdom that defines the job of a death row guard. You cannot punish a man who is already waiting to die. You have no power over him because the state has already taken everything. Percy didn't understand. He thought power came from the baton and the badge. He didn't realize that on the Green Mile, true power comes from maintaining the peace in the valley of the shadow of death. Percy was a chaos agent, and chaos is the one thing the mile cannot survive. Chapter 3. As the days turned into weeks, a pattern emerged that was too precise to be coincidence. Steamboat Willie, soon to be Mr. Jingles, began to time his visits. He would appear only when Percy was absent, off shift, or patrolling a distant sector of the prison. We floaters and regulars, the men who treated the job with a somber respect, were graced with the mouse's presence. Percy was denied it. One evening with the chief, Arlen Bitterbuck, nearing his final days, the mouse made a grand entrance. It was a moment of surreal community. The chief, staring down his own mortality, greeted the mouse as a spirit guide, finding a connection to the natural world he was about to leave. Even the cynical trustee, Toot Toot, tried to court the mouse's favor with scraps of bologna. But the mouse was discerning. It rejected the food from the trustee, sniffing it with disdain, yet eagerly accepted the same meat when offered by my hand or Dean's. It was a demonstration of trust that unnerved us. How could a rodent distinguish between the intent of the hands feeding it? It was as if the creature could read the aura of the men on the block. We stopped talking about it to outsiders. To speak of it would be to invite ridicule, or worse, to expose the magic to the harsh light of reality. We knew, silently, that this mouse was not just an animal. It was a witness. It knew Percy's darkness, and it knew our reluctance. In the pressure cooker of the Green Mile, where reality bends under the weight of impending death, we allowed ourselves to believe in the impossible because the alternative, that we were just men killing other men in a concrete box, was too heavy to bear without a little magic. Chapter 4. The machinery of death requires practice. A grim dress rehearsal to ensure the final performance faces no technical interruptions. On the Green Mile, this preparation was as much about the psychological insulation of the guards as it was about the mechanics of the electric chair. For the impending execution of Arlen Bitterbuck, a Washita elder who had killed a man in a drunken dispute over boots, the ritual began with the removal of the living man to the arcade. This was a holding area, a place of wire mesh and final goodbyes, separated from the business of dying. While Bitterbuck communed with his family, the guards turned their attention to his stand-in. This role fell to old Toot Toot, a trustee and fixture of the prison, who served as the grotesque mascot of the condemned. Toot Toot, a Cajun Canadian with a dark sense of humor, treated the rehearsal like a vaudeville act. Sitting on the bunk in the empty cell, he cracked jokes about the hygiene of the sheets, his eyes twinkling with a vitality that stood in stark contrast to the somber duty at hand. To him, playing dead was the most alive he ever felt. Paul Edgecombe, along with Dean Stanton and Harry Terwilliger, ran through the script. The procession was a choreographed dance of doom, the walk down the corridor, the turn toward the storage room where the chair waited, the kneeling for prayer. Toot Toot knew the lines better than the guards, reciting the prayers with a mocking piety that underscored the absurdity of seeking divine mercy in a slaughterhouse. The rehearsal moved to the death chamber itself. Here, Percy Wetmore, the governor's nephew and the block's resident source of toxicity, waited. He was stationed in the switch room, eager to see the sparks fly, ignorant of the gravity of the moment. The room contained a phone that connected only to the governor, a symbol of hope that, in Paul's experience, remained eternally silent. In the movies, salvation rings at the last second. On the Green Mile, the silence was the only answer. The guards practiced the strapping in. This was a critical moment where they were most vulnerable to a panicked prisoner. They clamped Toot Toot's ankles and wrists, simulating the shaving of the calf to ensure conductivity. When Brutus, Brutal Howl, asked the mock-condemned man for his last words, Toot Toot unleashed a vulgar request for fried chicken and the company of Mae West, shattering the tension. The guards, despite the grim context, dissolved into laughter. It was a release of pressure, a necessary venting of the stress that accumulates when men are paid to kill other men. But Paul knew the danger of such levity. If it bled into the real event, it would be a disaster. As the laughter died and the rehearsal concluded with the simulated activation of the generator, roll on 2, the reality of the room returned. And there, watching the proceedings with beady, intelligent eyes, was the mouse, a silent witness to the rehearsal of death, sitting quietly in the doorway, waiting for a tragedy not yet fully written. Chapter 5. When the time came for the actual event, the execution of Arlen Bitterbuck was categorized as successful, if the taking of a life can ever be deemed a success. The elder Cherokee met his end with a stoicism that shamed the steel and electricity used to kill him. His only moment of frailty came with his braids. His hands shook too violently to plait them, so his daughter performed this final kindness, though Paul had to deny her request to weave in hawk feathers. Regulations, rigid and unyielding, feared the feathers would catch fire. A small, horrific mercy in a process designed to burn a man from the inside out. Bitterbuck walked the mile without resistance. He paused to pray, weeping softly at the Psalms, a human reaction that reassured Paul. It is the ones who do not cry, the ones who bottle their terror until it explodes, who are the most dangerous. In the chair, under the gaze of the witnesses, Bitterbuck faltered only once, a low moan escaping him as the weight of the staring eyes pressed down. But with a subtle prompt from Paul to show them how a Washita does it, he regained his composure, kissing his braid in a final act of self-identity. The execution itself was a mechanical surge. The generator hummed, the lights dimmed, and the body in the chair lunged forward against the straps. It is a violent biological revolt, not a peaceful sleep. The smell that filled the room was specific and haunting, the scent of the transformer and burning biology. It was an olfactory scar that Paul would carry for decades, triggered years later even by a child's toy train set. After the doctor confirmed the heart had stopped, a disorganized rhythm fading into nothingness, the aftermath began. This is the part the public rarely considers: the cleanup. The body, smoking and smelling of ozone and death, had to be moved. Percy Wetmore, exposed to the visceral reality of his desires for the first time, recoiled at the stench. Yet his cruelty remained intact. As they moved the corpse through the dripping, dungeon-like tunnel toward the ambulance, Percy slapped the dead man's face, mocking him with a "hope hell's hot enough." Brutal's reaction was immediate and threatening. To the veteran guards, the debt was paid. Bitterbuck was no longer a criminal. He was a man who had squared his account with the house. Percy's disrespect violated the unwritten code of the mile. As they loaded the body, the shadows in the tunnel seemed to stretch, mirroring the darkness settling over the guards' souls. Chapter 6. Memory is a skeleton key, unlocking doors that perhaps should remain shut. Paul reflects on the burden of the past, realizing that to tell the story of John Coffey, he must excavate the entirety of that summer. The act of writing reveals connections his conscious mind had missed, like the presence of the mouse before Delacroix even arrived. But the heart of the memory remains John Coffey. A giant of a man, so large his feet dragged on the floor when he sat on his bunk, yet possessing a demeanor of incessant, watery sorrow. Coffey was not like the other prisoners on E Block. His tears were not for himself, or for the crime he was accused of, the murder of the Detterick twins. His grief seemed to encompass the entire world. Paul recalls the strange, disquieting empathy he felt for the giant. There was a sense that Coffey's suffering was a constant, physical thing, like a wound that wouldn't close. In the silence of the block, Paul often wished for a stay of execution, not out of legal doubt, but out of mercy for the man's internal agony. He wanted to give Coffey time to let the pain ease, though deep down he suspected that for a creature like John Coffey, the pain of the world was a burden that could never be set down. Chapter 7. The rhythm of the mile was disrupted by the arrival of Edouard Delacroix, a small, balding Frenchman whose entrance was marked not by dignity, but by chaos. Percy Wetmore, seeking to assert a dominance he did not naturally possess, dragged the shackled man onto the block, beating him with a baton. The scene was a violation of protocol and decency. Delacroix, screaming in a mix of Cajun French and English, was helpless against the assault. Paul intervened, not just to stop the violence, but to maintain the fragile order of the Green Mile. Percy's rage was fueled by a perceived slight. He claimed Delacroix had tried to touch him intimately during the transport. The truth, as confirmed by Brutal later, was far more mundane. The prisoner had stumbled, and his hand had brushed Percy's groin in an attempt to break his fall. Percy, insecure and hateful, had used the accident as an excuse to inflict pain. The confrontation that followed highlighted the political corruption rotting the institution. When Paul reprimanded him, Percy didn't cringe. He threatened. He wielded his familial connection to the governor like a weapon, immune to the discipline that would have cost any other guard their job. Percy was a tourist in this land of death, a boy pulling the wings off flies because he knew no one could stop him. Delacroix, now cowering in his cell, was left broken and terrified, a victim of a system where the guards could be as dangerous as the inmates. Chapter 8. Peace returned to the mile tentatively, but the atmosphere remained charged. The state was preparing for John Coffey's trial, but on the block, the focus shifted to a small miracle. Delacroix, the man beaten into submission, was heard laughing. Paul and the other guards discovered the source of this joy. The mouse. The rodent, previously a phantom of the corridor, had allowed itself to be tamed. Delacroix named him Mr. Jingles, insisting the mouse had whispered the name to him. The creature performed tricks, running up Delacroix's arm and across his shoulders, displaying a level of trust that seemed impossible in such a harsh environment. Percy's reaction to this bonding was chilling. He didn't lash out immediately. Instead, he adopted a mask of calm, offering to help Delacroix secure a home for the pet. He suggested a cigar box and even provided cotton for bedding. It appeared to be a gesture of kindness, but Paul recognized the predator's patience in Percy's eyes. Percy was simply biding his time, allowing the attachment to grow so that the eventual destruction of the happiness would be all the more devastating. Behind the scenes, the politics of the prison were shifting. Warden Hal Moores, a man Paul respected, revealed the depth of the compromise required to keep the peace. Percy had been threatening to use his connections to have Paul reassigned. To protect his staff and the operation, Moores had struck a devil's bargain. If Percy stopped rocking the boat, he would be granted a front-row seat to Delacroix's execution. He would be allowed to lead the procession. Percy accepted. He would trade his threats for the privilege of killing the Frenchman. Chapter 9. The Green Mile briefly transformed into something resembling a home for the odd little family of guards, a murderer, and a mouse. The cigar box, purchased from Toot Toot after some negotiation, became the Mousy Hilton. Lined with Percy's cotton, it sat in Delacroix's cell, a beacon of domesticity in a cage of concrete. The mouse, Mr. Jingles, proved to be an extraordinary creature. He seemed to possess an intelligence that bordered on the supernatural. Delacroix delighted in showing off his pet's appetite for peppermint candies, though Brutal had to intervene to prevent the mouse from being fed to death. The image of the mouse holding a pink mint, munching away like a guest at a tea party, provided a surreal counterpoint to the impending doom of the electric chair. The bond deepened with the introduction of a wooden spool. Delacroix taught Mr. Jingles to fetch and roll the spool, and soon Harry Terwilliger brought in crayons to decorate it. The spool became a circus prop, bright yellow, green and red. Delacroix, beaming with a pride that erased the shadows of his crimes, announced the circus mouse to his audience of guards. For a moment, the Green Mile was not a waiting room for death, but a place of simple, impossible magic. However, the shadow of Percy Wetmore hung over every moment of joy. He watched the tricks with a cool detachment, having facilitated the mouse's comfort only to heighten the stakes of his own cruel game. The guards laughed and marveled, but the underlying tension remained, the knowledge that in this place, happiness was a fragile anomaly, waiting to be crushed. Chapter 10. Time on the mile is fluid, measured not in dates but in events. The execution of Delacroix was moved up, the schedule tightening like a noose. But before that grim appointment, a new storm arrived in the form of William Wild Bill Wharton. On the day Wharton was due to arrive, Paul's body betrayed him. A dormant urinary infection flared with a vengeance, turning the simple act of relieving himself into a torture session of razor blades and fire. The pain was debilitating, dropping him to his knees in his own backyard, a physical manifestation of the internal rot of the prison system. Despite the agony, duty compelled him to the prison early. He intended to seek medical help and ensure the roster was covered, but he found something far more tragic in the warden's office. Hal Moores, usually the picture of composed authority, was weeping. The cause was not the prison, but his wife, Melinda. A brain tumor, deep and inoperable, had been discovered. She was given until Christmas. Paul forgot his own burning pain in the face of Moore's devastation. He comforted the warden, holding the sobbing man as he grieved for the future he was losing. It was a moment of profound vulnerability, stripping away the uniforms and the ranks to reveal two frightened men. Paul left the office without asking for the sick leave he desperately needed. He would work through the pain, fueled by a sense of solidarity and the grim knowledge that on the Green Mile, suffering was the only currency that mattered. He walked toward E Block, unaware that the arrival of William Wharton was about to unleash a new level of chaos upon them all. Chapter 11. The aftermath of violence often leaves a silence heavier than the noise that preceded it. Late that afternoon, the guards of Cold Mountain's E Block were left contemplating a near-fatal error in judgment. Dean Stanton, voice reduced to a rasping bark, bore the physical evidence of this mistake, blackish-purple bruises blooming on his neck. The pain of speaking was visible on his face, yet silence would have been more painful. They had all assumed the new prisoner, William Wharton, was doped to the gills. It was a collective failure of due diligence. No one had asked the doctor. They simply cruised along on the assumption that things were going according to procedure. There is a psychological trap in routine work, even in a prison. The belief that today will be like yesterday. Brutal Howell and Paul Edgecombe exchanged looks that acknowledged this complacency. Dean and Harry Terwilliger would learn from this brush with death. But Percy sat alone, sulking. The incident hadn't taught him caution. It had only plunged him deeper into his own resentment. The prisoner in question, William Wild Bill Wharton, had been transferred from Indianola. 7 men had been required to move him in a reinforced Ford panel truck, a vehicle resembling a cross between a milk wagon and an armoured car. Harry Terwilliger had taken custody of Wharton from a sheriff who couldn't be bothered to dress the prisoner in prison blues. Wharton had appeared in a hospital gown, a scrawny, pimply figure with tangled blonde hair and a deceptive vacuity in his eyes. He stood silent, staring out a window, seemingly catatonic. It is often the most dangerous predators who know how to play dead. Wharton projected the persona of a backcountry dullard, a man with a slack jaw and distant eyes, appearing completely burnt out on morphine. This performance lulled the guards into a false sense of security. They dressed him like a doll, Dean Stanton having to manipulate the man's limbs to get his trousers on. Wharton didn't resist. He simply waited. He was conserving his energy for chaos, not escape. He was a creature of pure, unadulterated meanness, the kind of human anomaly who finds joy only in disruption and pain. The journey to the prison was uneventful, further cementing the illusion of a sedated prisoner. But upon arrival at E Block, When the extra guards had departed, the trap was sprung. As Dean unlocked the door to the block, Wharton, hands shackled but with a chain dangerously too long, snapped into action. He unleashed a screaming rebel yell, a sound so inhuman Paul Edgecombe initially mistook it for a wounded animal, and looped his chain over Dean's head. This moment reveals the terrifying speed of violence. 1 second, a comatose drifter. The next, a coiled spring of lethal intent. Wharton began to strangle Dean, dragging him into the Green Mile, laughing and gibbering with maniacal glee. Harry Terwilliger attempted to intervene but was thrown off with shocking strength. And Percy? Percy Wetmore, who so loved to brandish his hickory baton, froze. Confronted with a true whirling devil rather than a submissive victim, Percy's bravado evaporated, leaving him paralyzed by fear. It was brutal Howl who ended the chaos. Stepping into the fray, he shoved the useless Percy aside and delivered a crushing blow to the back of Wharton's head with his baton. The sound was hollow, sickening, but effective. Wharton collapsed, and Dean crawled away, gasping for air. In the present day, an elderly Paul Edgecombe writes this account from the solarium of the Georgia Pines nursing home, or retirement complex, as the brochures claim. The past is never truly dead for Paul. It haunts the flickering screens of the television room. A viewing of the film Kiss of Death triggers a panic attack. The villain on screen, with his lank blonde hair and gleeful sadism, is a perfect doppelganger for William Wharton. It reminds Paul that true evil often wears a human face, giggling as it pushes the helpless down the stairs. His friend Elaine comforts him, but the ghosts of the Green Mile are stubborn. They remind him that he has seen monsters before, and he knows exactly what they look like. Part 3, Chapter 1. The narrative shifts back to 1932, immediately following Brutal's knockout blow. Wharton lay on the linoleum, a trickle of blood escaping his hair, looking deceptively peaceful. The contrast between the chaos he caused and his slumbering form was jarring. They dragged him to his cell, the problem child finally contained. But the incident had taken a toll on Paul. Throughout the struggle, he had been battling a severe urinary infection, a ghost of a sickness that felt like passing shards of glass. The stress of the attack had spiked his fever, leaving him sweating and trembling. After sending Percy to report to the warden, a task designed to get the incompetent guard off the block, Paul retreated to the staff bathroom, barely suppressing screams of agony as his body betrayed him. The physical vulnerability of the protagonist here serves as a crucial counterpoint to the brute strength of the prisoners. Paul is the authority figure, yet he is brought to his knees by microscopic bacteria. He returns to the duty desk, feverish and exhausted, only to find John Coffey awake and watching him. Coffey, the giant black man convicted of murdering 2 little girls, had been silent during the brawl. Now he spoke. "I need to see you, boss." His voice was urgent. In a rational state, Paul would have refused. Entering a condemned man's cell alone, especially after the security breach with Wharton, was grounds for dismissal and potentially suicidal. But pain and fever have a way of eroding judgment, or perhaps opening the mind to the impossible. Drawn by the strange intensity in Coffey's eyes, Paul unlocked the cell. Chapter 2. What followed defies the logic of the penal system and medical science. Paul sat beside the giant, who outweighed him by a massive margin. Coffey's demeanor was not one of aggression, but of serene, sad purpose. "Just to help," Coffey whispered. He reached out and placed his large hand over Paul's groin. Paul tried to recoil, but a sudden jolt froze him. It wasn't electricity, but a sensation of absolute displacement, as if the world had been squeezed. The pain vanished instantly. The fever broke. In the span of a heartbeat, the agony that had plagued Paul for days was simply erased. But the cost was visible on Coffey. The prisoner gagged, his throat bulging, and then exhaled a cloud of what looked like tiny black insects. These no-see-ums swirled, turned white, and vanished into the air. This scene is the pivot point of the entire saga. It juxtaposes the earlier violence of Wharton, destructive, chaotic, physical, with the supernatural grace of Coffey. One man uses his hands to strangle, the other uses them to heal. Delacroix, watching from across the corridor with his pet mouse, Mr. Jingles, was terrified, screaming that Coffey was a gree-gree man, a voodoo practitioner. To the superstitious Cajun, such power could only be dark magic. But Paul knew better. He had grown up in the Bible Belt, surrounded by stories of laying on of hands and praise Jesus miracles. He felt the absence of pain, the clarity of his mind. When he asked Coffey what he had done, the giant only murmured, "I helped it, didn't I?" Coffey was an enigma wrapped in a mystery, a vessel for a power he didn't seem to understand himself. He was merely a conduit. Paul retreated to his desk, shaken to his core. He considered documenting the event, writing the word miracle on the block report, but refrained. Who would believe it? Instead, he was left with a profound theological and moral dilemma. If God had placed this healing power into the hands of a child murderer, what was the divine plan? The cognitive dissonance was deafening. Paul Edgecombe, a man of the law, was now indebted to a man on death row. Chapter 3. The next morning, driven by a need to reconcile the miracle with the man's crimes, Paul drove to Tropingus County to find answers. He sought out Bert Hammersmith, the reporter who had covered the Coffey trial. Paul's wife, Janice, sensed his unease, but Paul framed his journey as simple curiosity. He found Hammersmith at home, a domestic scene that stood in stark contrast to the grim reality of the prison. Hammersmith was a sharp, cynical man, his worldview hardened by his profession. He recounted the details of Coffey's arrest, the posse finding the giant holding the dead Deterick girls, wailing on the riverbank. But Paul was looking for something else. He wanted to know if Coffey had a history of violence, a backtrail that would explain the murders. Hammersmith's response was chilling in its sociological fatalism. He explained that men like Coffey, drifters, marginalized figures in the crushing poverty of the Depression, often appeared out of nowhere. There was no paper trail, no history to check. But Hammersmith had a specific lesson he wanted to impart, one that utilized a disturbing metaphor. He pointed to his son, Caleb, playing in the yard. The boy's face was horribly disfigured, scarred by a massive bite. Hammersmith told the story of their family dog, Sir Galahad. The dog had been a gentle, loving pet, a mongrel that the family adored. Then, one day, for no apparent reason, the dog snapped and mauled Caleb's face. Hammersmith had taken his rifle and shot the dog immediately. Here the reporter lays out the prevailing prejudice of the era, cloaked in pseudo-intellectual cynicism. He compares John Coffey to that mongrel dog. He argues that your Negro might seem gentle, might seem harmless, but like the dog, he is capable of sudden, inexplicable violence because it is in his nature. It's like he dropped out of the sky, Hammersmith said of Coffey, but in his mind, Coffey's guilt was as inevitable as the dog's bite. He raped them, he killed them, Hammersmith insisted, snapping his fingers against his thumb to mimic a biting mouth, and afterward he was sorry. But those little girls stayed dead. Paul left the interview feeling drained. The reporter's story was a wall of common sense and prejudice that blocked any alternative view of Coffey. Hammersmith had facts, the dead girls, the bloody dog, while Paul had only a feeling and a healed infection. The horror of the boy's scarred face served as a tangible warning. Do not trust the gentle beast. Yet Paul couldn't shake the memory of Coffey's touch. He had looked into the eyes of the man society deemed a rabid animal and found something that felt like grace. The conflict between what the world knew about John Coffey and what Paul had experienced was now an open wound, one that no amount of logic could stitch shut. Chapter 5. The arrival of William Wharton, the man who dubbed himself Billy the Kid, marked a shift in the atmosphere of the Green Mile, introducing a chaotic, feral energy that disrupted the somber routine of death row. From the moment he arrived, Wharton was a test of the guard's patience and control. The very next day after his intake, he took his first trip to the restraint room, the padded cell designed for those who refused to adhere to the rigid structure of prison life. Wharton's strategy was psychological warfare, masked as compliance. He spent the daylight hours in a state of unnatural quiet, a stillness that Paul Edgecombe and his team quickly recognized not as submission, but as the calm before an ambush. That evening, the trap sprung. Harry Terwilliger, one of the guards, felt a warm splash against his freshly pressed uniform. Wharton, standing at his cell bars with a blackened, maniacal grin, had urinated on him. It wasn't just an act of disrespect. It was a declaration of territory, a primal assertion of dominance from a man who had no power left but his own bodily functions. The guards, however, operated on a system of swift, overwhelming retribution to maintain order. They couldn't allow an inmate to run the block. Paul, along with Brutal Howell, Dean, and Percy Wetmore, initiated full coverage. They prepared the Wetmore solution, a grimly ironic name considering Percy's usual incompetence, but fitting here as they utilized a high-pressure fire hose connected to the storage room water main. When they approached Wharton's cell, he was still posturing, exposing himself and laughing with the manic glee of a child at a carnival. He taunted them, threatening violence and mocking their attempts to control him. He seemed to believe he was the protagonist of a Western movie, challenging them to a showdown. But the Green Mile isn't a movie, and the guards didn't play by duelists' rules. As Brutal distracted Wharton, Paul gave the order. The fire hose blasted a jet of water with enough force to stagger a man. It hit Wharton squarely, pinning him, spinning him, and driving him under his bunk. It was a violent, necessary restoration of hierarchy. In the chaos, the other inmates reacted, Delacroix cackling in hysteria, while John Coffey remained silent, observing with a sorrowful serenity, as if he had witnessed this cycle of violence 1,000 times before. They dragged a battered and semi-conscious Wharton from the cell and trussed him into a straitjacket with practiced efficiency. Even as they hauled him away, Wharton's facade of the outlaw Wild Bill cracked, revealing a terrified, furious man screaming about historical inaccuracies regarding the real Wild Bill Hickok. He was desperate to control his own narrative, but on the mile, the guards wrote the story. They dumped him in the restraint room, leaving him to thrash in the dark. But Wharton's war wasn't over. Upon his return to his cell the next day, he played the role of the chastened prisoner perfectly, lulling the guards into a false sense of security. He even managed to illicitly buy a moon pie from the trustee's snack wagon. When Brutal performed his checks later, Wharton revealed his new weapon. He had chewed the moon pie into a chocolate sludge and spat it directly into Brutal's face, simulating a grotesque act of disrespect. It was a moment of sheer absurdity mixed with malice. Brutal, wiping the mess from his face, sent Wharton straight back to the padded room. This cycle of rebellion and restraint highlighted the terrifying persistence of Wharton's madness. He was a man who would burn down the world just to see the sparks, indifferent to his own destruction. Chapter 6. While the chaos of Wharton consumed the prison, Paul Edgecombe's personal life was being eroded by a quieter, more insidious tragedy. The warden's wife, Melinda Moores, had returned home from the hospital, sent back to die. The doctors, armed with their X-rays and morphine, could do nothing more for her brain tumor. Paul and his wife, Janice, went to visit. The sight of Melinda was a shock to the system. The vibrant woman was gone, replaced by a skeletal figure sitting in a sunbeam, her skin like parchment. The domestic setting, the cozy house, the hearthrug, felt jarringly wrong, as if the shadow of the Green Mile had stretched all the way to the warden's living room. Melinda was losing herself. Her personality was being eaten away by the tumor, leaving behind pain and confusion. She wept soundlessly, a haunting echo of John Coffey's own sorrowful weeping. The connection to Coffey was becoming inescapable for Paul. In his mind, a refrain kept playing. "I helped it, didn't I?" It was what Coffey had said after curing Paul's urinary infection, and now, seeing Melinda's suffering, the words took on a desperate, heavy weight. The juxtaposition of the miraculous healing Paul had experienced and the hopeless decay of Melinda Moore's created a cognitive dissonance he couldn't quite resolve. Later, Paul and his wife shared a moment of intimacy, a reaffirmation of life and health that was made possible by Coffey's touch. Yet as Paul drove back to the prison, the dread returned. The looming execution of Delacroix and the volatile presence of Percy Wetmore weighed on him. The infection in his body was gone, but a different kind of sickness, a spiritual freezing, was taking hold. He sensed that the coming days would bring a darkness that no amount of medicine could cure. Chapter 7. The dichotomy of life on the Green Mile, where compassion and cruelty walked hand in hand, was nowhere more evident than in the rehearsal organized for Edouard Delacroix. It was a charade, a kindness built on a lie. The guards told Delacroix that a group of important visitors, including a politician, wanted to see his pet mouse, Mr. Jingles, perform. In reality, the visitors were just other guards and staff, but for Delacroix, this was his moment of glory. The illusion gave him a sense of purpose and worth in his final hours. He prepared with the seriousness of a stage performer, ensuring Mr. Jingles had his props, the spool and the peppermint. When he stepped out of his cell, chest puffed out, he wasn't a condemned murderer, he was a ringmaster. John Coffey played along, his gentle nature reinforcing the fantasy, encouraging Del to knock 'em for a loop. It was a heartbreaking scene, grown men engaging in a collective fantasy to comfort a man who had committed horrific crimes, proving that empathy can exist even in the shadow of the electric chair. As Delacroix marched off to the exercise yard to perform for his imaginary dignitaries, Paul watched, keenly aware that they were all performing in a circus of a different kind, just waiting for their turn in the ring. Chapter 8. The actual rehearsal for the execution proceeded with surprising smoothness. Percy Wetmore, usually a liability, seemed engaged and competent, driven perhaps by the vanity of being centre stage. The guards allowed themselves a moment of relief, thinking that perhaps the execution would go off without a hitch. This false sense of security, however, was shattered in seconds. The catalyst was a moment of casual carelessness. Percy, high on the success of the rehearsal and perhaps feeling a rare moment of camaraderie, drifted too close to Wild Bill Wharton's cell while joking with Delacroix. He forgot the cardinal rule of the mile: stay in the centre, out of reach. Wharton moved with terrifying speed. He wasn't catatonic. He was waiting. He snatched Percy through the bars, seizing him by the throat. The violence was immediate and sexualized. Wharton whispered grotesque threats, kissing Percy's ear, and terrified him to his core. It was a total deconstruction of Percy's arrogance. The bully was suddenly the victim, helpless in the grip of a true predator. When Wharton released him, feigning innocence, the damage was done. Percy was hyperventilating, cowering against the opposite bars. Then came the sound that would seal a terrible fate. Laughter. Not from Wharton, but from Delacroix. The little Frenchman, seeing his tormentor humbled, pointed and howled with derision. Percy had wet his pants. The stain was visible, undeniable. Delacroix's mockery was absolute. He stripped away the last of Percy's dignity, broadcasting the humiliation to everyone on the block. Percy's reaction was a mix of shame and cold, venomous rage. He threatened the guards with his political connections if they spoke of it, but his eyes were fixed on Delacroix. In that moment, the dynamic shifted fatally. Percy wasn't just a cruel incompetent anymore. He was a man seeking vengeance for a mortal wound to his ego. Delacroix, in his delight at seeing the bully broken, had unwittingly signed a warrant for suffering far worse than death. Chapter 9. The atmosphere on the mile thickened as the execution drew near. The weather turned oppressive, a humid, heavy heat that felt unnatural for October. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a pathetic fallacy mirroring the tension inside the prison walls. It felt like last time's weather, an apocalyptic backdrop for the end of a life. Paul's conversation with his colleague Bill Dodge revealed the unease permeating the staff. Even the jokes about Wharton's crude behavior felt hollow. The heat was suffocating, and the air charged with electricity, as if the prison itself was building up a charge that had to be released. There was a collective intuition that something bad was approaching, something beyond the mandated death of a prisoner. The air was heavy with the promise of violence. Chapter 10. On the eve of his execution, Delacroix's concerns were entirely focused on the legacy of Mr. Jingles. The human capacity for displacement is powerful. Rather than facing the terror of the electric chair, Del obsessed over the care of a mouse. He played an endless game of fetch with the spool, the repetitive clack-clatter grating on Paul's nerves, amplifying the tension. Paul and the other guards found themselves in a bind. They needed to give Del peace of mind, but the reality that a mouse wouldn't survive long without him was too harsh to speak. It was Brutal who improvised the salvation. Mouseville. Brutal spun a fantastical tale about a tourist attraction in Florida, a city built for trained mice with trapeze acts and tiny houses. It was a beautiful, elaborate lie. Delacroix was entranced. The idea that his beloved companion would live out his days as a star in a mouse circus gave him a profound sense of relief. It was a moment of pure grace, the guards constructing a heaven for a rodent to save a man's soul from despair. Del, ecstatic, threw the spool with all his might. It skittered out of the cell onto the green mile. Mr. Jingles chased it, blind to danger. Percy Wetmore was waiting. He saw the mouse. He saw the joy on Delacroix's face, and he remembered the laughter from the day before. With a cold, deliberate motion, Percy stomped on the mouse. The sound of the breaking back was sickeningly audible. Mr. Jingles lay broken and bleeding. The cruelty of the act was absolute. It wasn't just about killing an animal. It was about destroying the one thing Delacroix loved, shattering the peace the guards had worked so hard to build. Delacroix's scream was a sound of pure heartbreak. Percy simply smiled, his vengeance achieved, leaving the little body broken on the linoleum as a testament to his pettiness. It was a darkness that rivaled even Wharton's chaos, born not of madness, but of spite. Part 4. Chapter 1. Decades later, Paul Edgecombe, now a resident of the Georgia Pines nursing home, finds himself trapped in a different kind of confinement. He writes his memoirs in a shed in the woods, trying to outrun the Georgia Pines time, the senility that erases identity. The past bleeds into the present. The damp air of the woods triggers aches in his old bones, but also memories of the rain and ozone of 1932. But the monsters of the past have echoes in the present. Brad Dolan, an orderly at the home, is a resurrection of Percy Wetmore's spirit. He is a bully who thrives on small power trips, harassing Paul about his walks, squeezing his wrist just to cause pain. Dolan calls him Paulie, a diminutive intended to demean, just as Percy used language to belittle the inmates. When Dolan catches Paul returning from the woods, the interaction is terrifyingly familiar. Dolan demands to know what Paul is doing, his curiosity laced with malice. He threatens to label Paul as senile if he complains about the physical abuse, a gaslighting tactic that mirrors Percy's threats to get the guards fired. Paul realizes that evil acts are cyclical. The faces change, from Percy Wetmore to Brad Dolan, but the spirit of the bully remains constant. They are the people who crush the things we love just to see us bleed. As Paul retreats to the solarium to write, Warned by his friend Elaine that Dolan is watching him, he understands that he is still on the Green Mile. The mile is just longer now, stretching through time, and the executioner is wearing an orderly's uniform, waiting for a chance to stomp on whatever joy Paul has left. Chapter 2. The tension on the Green Mile had been winding tight as a watch spring, and it finally snapped with a sickening crunch. Percy Wetmore, a man whose pettiness was only eclipsed by his cruelty, had been waiting for this moment. Despite the warnings, despite the precarious peace of the cell block, he made his move. As Mr. Jingles chased the coloured spool across the linoleum, oblivious to the malice looming above him, Percy brought his heavy black work shoe down. There was an awful, audible snap. It was the sound of a spine breaking, a sound that no living thing should ever make. Blood gushed from the mouse's mouth, and its tiny eyes bulged with a shock that looked devastatingly human. This wasn't just an animal dying. It was an act of pure domination by a weak man, desperate to feel strong. Delacroix's reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. The small Cajun prisoner threw himself against the bars of his cell, screaming the mouse's name, his grief raw and unfiltered. Percy, standing over his kill, offered nothing but a smug smile. He viewed the destruction of something so small as a victory, a testament to the warping effect of authority on a hollow soul. He walked away, leaving the broken creature on the green floor, indifferent to the suffering he had caused. The other guards were stunned into silence, but the mile has its own way of balancing the scales. John Coffey's deep voice rumbled from his cell. He didn't scream like Del. He simply asked for the mouse. There was an urgency in his tone, a command that transcended his status as a prisoner. When Paul Edgecombe picked up Mr. Jingles, the reality of the damage was sickening. The mouse felt like a bag of splintered bones. It was a hopeless cause by any medical standard. Yet Paul handed the creature to Coffey. In the hands of the giant, the mouse looked impossibly small. Coffey cupped his hands, creating a dark protective chamber. The only sign of life was the mouse's tail, hanging like a dying pendulum. But then, the atmosphere shifted. Coffey inhaled sharply, and the air in the block seemed to suspend. We see here the physical toll of Coffey's gift. His face went grey, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. He was absorbing the damage, taking the pain of another living thing into himself. Then, the miracle happened. The tail began to flick, bristling with life. Coffey exhaled, and a cloud of black particulates, like swarming insects, poured from his mouth, turning white before vanishing into the ether. It was the physical manifestation of the evil he had extracted. When he opened his hands, Mr. Jingles didn't just survive. He ran. He scampered back to Delacroix, whole and healthy, leaving the guards in a state of hypnotized wonder. However, Stephen King grounds this supernatural event in gritty reality. When Delacroix tossed the spool again, the mouse ran with a slight limp. It was a subtle, brilliant detail, a reminder that while the miracle was real, the trauma had happened. It wasn't a dream. The memory of the pain remained, etched into the creature's gait. Chapter 3. If the resurrection of the mouse was a moment of grace, what followed was a descent back into the bureaucratic purgatory of the prison. Paul and Brutal found Percy in the storage room later, polishing the oak legs of old Sparky, the electric chair. There is something profoundly disturbing about the domesticity of the act, Percy humming a tune while shining the instrument of death. It revealed his addiction to the power the chair represented. Paul and Brutal knew that Percy was a liability. He was a piece of grit in the machinery of the mile, and sooner or later he would cause a catastrophe. They decided to use the incident with the mouse as leverage, not to punish him, but to excise him. They cornered him, stripping away his veneer of political invulnerability. They offered him a deal, or rather an ultimatum. Percy wanted to be out front for Delacroix's execution. He wanted the glory of leading the show. Paul and Brutal offered him the lead role, but the price was his departure. He had to transfer to Briar Ridge, the mental asylum, immediately after. To ensure his compliance, they played on his deepest fear, the inmates themselves. They threatened to expose his cowardice regarding Wild Bill Wharton, the chaotic and violent prisoner who terrified Percy to his core. The psychological interplay here is fascinating. Percy, despite his arrogance and his connections to the governor, was fundamentally a coward. The threat of humiliation and the physical threat of the prisoners cracked his defiance. He agreed to the terms. A handshake sealed the pact, a deal made in the shadow of the electric chair. Paul and Brutal believed they had solved the problem, securing peace for the mile after one last difficult night. But in their relief, they underestimated the depths of Percy's spite. They assumed he was merely incompetent and mean, failing to recognize that humiliation often breeds a desire for a much darker kind of retribution. Chapter 4. The day of Edouard Delacroix's execution arrived under the heavy shroud of an October storm. The weather acted as a pathetic fallacy, the skies turning bruised and violent, mirroring the impending violence on the ground. Thunder rattled the tin roof of the storage shed, and the heat was oppressive, a stifling pressure cooker that frayed the nerves of guards and witnesses alike. The preparations began with a poignant farewell. Delacroix, facing his final hour, was more concerned with the fate of Mr. Jingles than his own life. He entrusted the mouse to Paul and Brutal, believing the fabricated story of a Mouseville in Florida, a gentle lie told to ease a dying man's soul. There is a profound tragedy in Del blowing a kiss to the mouse, a moment of pure love from a man condemned for monstrous acts. It highlights the complexity of the human condition that the Green Mile explores. Even the guilty are capable of tenderness. As the procession moved to the chair, the atmosphere turned electric, literally and metaphorically. The witnesses, sweating and anxious, watched as Del was strapped in. And then the deviation occurred. Percy Wetmore, taking center stage as agreed, prepared the headpiece. Protocol dictated that the sponge, soaked in brine to conduct the electricity swiftly to the brain, be brought to the helmet. Instead, Percy brought the helmet to the sponge. It was a subtle movement, easily missed in the high-stress environment, but it was the signature of doom. Percy had deliberately neglected to soak the sponge. He had asked questions about it earlier, feigning curiosity, but he was actually learning how to inflict maximum suffering. He wanted to know what would happen if the circuit was dry. When the switch was thrown, the horror began. Usually, the current causes a violent but quick seizure, followed by death. But without the conductive brine, the electricity met resistance. Instead of a swift strike to the brain, the current began to cook Delacroix from the outside in. The hum of the machine turned into a ragged, crackling roar. Smoke curled from beneath the leather mask, followed by the sickening scent of burning hair and flesh. The scene descended into absolute chaos. Delacroix didn't die instantly. He screamed. The witnesses panicked, screaming as the prisoner slammed against the restraints, his body convulsing in agony. Paul and Brutal were trapped in a nightmare scenario. Brutal, realizing the sponge was dry, instinctively wanted to stop, but they knew they couldn't. To stop the current now would leave Delacroix alive but horrifically maimed, a torturous existence worse than death. The only mercy left was to finish it. They forced the execution to continue. For 2 minutes, an eternity in the execution room, Delacroix burned. His body caught fire, the mask peeling away to reveal a face destroyed by the heat. It was a vision of hell brought to earth, orchestrated by Percy's petty vengeance. When the current finally cut off, Delacroix was nothing more than a smoking ruin. The storm outside raged on, but inside, the silence was heavy with the smell of roasted meat and the weight of a terrible, irreversible sin. Chapter 5. The aftermath of the botched execution took place in the damp, gloomy tunnel beneath the storage shed. The adrenaline of the disaster began to curdle into shock and rage. As they loaded the smoking remains of Delacroix onto the gurney, the magnitude of what Percy had done settled over the team. Brutal, usually the stoic enforcer, finally snapped. He lunged for Percy, intending to deliver a beating that might have killed the smaller man. Paul intervened, not to save Percy, but to save Brutal. In the unforgiving logic of the prison system, striking another officer would cost Brutal his job, his pension, and perhaps his freedom. Paul, ever the pragmatist, saw the bigger picture even through his own disgust. They backed Percy against the brick wall of the tunnel. The shadows stretched long and distorted, reflecting the moral distortion of the night. Percy, terrified but still clinging to his script, claimed he didn't know the sponge was supposed to be wet. It was a lie that fooled no one present. The malice was too precise, the negligence too calculated. When Curtis Anderson, the warden's stand-in, arrived, the scene teetered on the edge of total collapse. Anderson was furious, sickened by the carnage and the smell that would linger for years. But Paul and the others made a split-second decision to protect the institution over the truth. They framed the event as an accident born of incompetence, not malice. They called Percy a chump, a screw-up, effectively shielding him from criminal charges, but locking him into a narrative of utter failure. This was a tactical move. By labeling it a mistake, they avoided a public scandal that would destroy the prison administration and their own livelihoods. However, they used this leverage to seal Percy's fate. Paul made it clear to Anderson and to Percy that the transfer to Briar Ridge was non-negotiable. Percy was trapped. He could not stay where he was despised and threatened, and he could not complain to his political connections without revealing his own incompetence. The chapter closes with a chilling resolution. Percy was isolated, stripped of his power, and forced to retreat. The team had survived the night, but the cost was high. They were complicit in a cover-up, bound together by the shared trauma of Delacroix's bad death. The Green Mile had claimed another life, but this time it had taken a piece of the guards' humanity with it, leaving them in the cold, dripping dark of the tunnel, waiting for the dawn that would bring no real relief. Chapter 6. The clock ticked past 1:15 in the morning, and the block had settled into a heavy, suffocating silence. We had returned to our posts, the grim ritual of execution finished, but the air still felt charged with the static of death. Percy Wetmore, the architect of the night's disaster, had been banished to the storage room to clean up, sulking through his punishment like a petulant child. I sat at the duty desk, fighting the urge to collapse. If I had moved to the comfort of my office chair, sleep would have claimed me instantly, despite the adrenaline that had been pumping through my veins since the previous night. It feels strange to say one could sleep after witnessing such horror, but exhaustion has a way of overriding the soul's objections. Down the Green Mile, the reactions of the inmates painted a portrait of madness and sorrow. John Coffey stood at his cell door, and it was here that the true weight of the supernatural began to press down on me. Tears streamed endlessly from his eyes, distant, unreadable eyes. It wasn't normal weeping. It was as if he were bleeding from a wound that caused no physical pain, but drained his spirit. In stark contrast, William Wharton, the resident chaotic evil of E Block, was rocking on his bunk. He began to sing a song of his own making, a barbecue song, mocking the charred remains of Edouard Delacroix. It is fascinating, looking back, to see how evil manifests differently. Percy's evil was petty, bureaucratic, and cruel. Wharton's was elemental, a green and stinking intelligence that thrived on suffering. I silenced him, but his grin remained, a predator sensing blood in the water. I approached Coffey. He was wiping his eyes, exhausted. He looked at me and spoke of Delacroix, not with horror, but with a strange envy. "He's the luckiest one," Coffey said. To a being like John Coffey, who feels the world's pain like a physical weight, perhaps the oblivion of death truly did look like luck. But then the conversation shifted. Coffey knew my thoughts before I spoke them. I asked about the mouse, Mr. Jingles, and Coffey pointed toward the restraint room. But the mouse was gone. Its time on the mile finished. I should have walked away. I should have written my report. But a compulsion seized me. A need to know. I dropped to one knee before the giant condemned man and began to untie my shoe. It was a test, though I didn't fully understand the stakes of it yet. Chapter 7. By the time I reached my home, the storm had broken. The rain ceased, leaving a late moon grinning over the ridges. But the sensory memory of the prison followed me. I could smell the burned flesh of Delacroix on my skin, a phantom scent of ozone and death. This is the burden of the executioner. You bring the job home, no matter how hard you scrub. Janice was awake. She always was on these nights. I tried to shield her from the grotesque reality of the botched execution, but she saw the trauma etched into my face. We sat in the kitchen, and I broke down. A man's stoicism is a fragile dam, and that night, the waters rose too high. In her arms, I found a measure of peace, proving that connection is the only antidote to the mile's poison. It was then, in the safety of my home, that the epiphany struck me. It wasn't about the shoe, not yet. It was the eyes. I realized that John Coffey and Melinda Moores, the warden's dying wife, shared the exact same gaze. Woeful, distant, detached, dying eyes. This visual link bridged the gap between the innocent woman and the condemned murderer, suggesting a shared spiritual state that transcended their circumstances. Sleep came in thin, unsatisfactory licks. My mind drifted to theology, the concept of atonement. In the backwoods churches of the South, atonement is a powerful lock on the door of the past. I fell into a dream, a subconscious tapestry weaving together my guilt and my suspicions. In the dream, Coffey sat on a riverbank holding two dead blonde girls weeping. When I approached him and opened his fists, they didn't hold weapons. One held a spool of colored thread. The other held my shoe. "I couldn't help it," Dream Coffey said. "I tried to take it back, but it was too late." The subconscious mind often solves puzzles the conscious mind is too afraid to touch. I woke up understanding that his words at the crime scene had been misinterpreted. He wasn't confessing to murder. He was confessing to a failure to heal. Chapter 8. The next morning brought a phone call that set the gears of fate into motion. Hal Moores, the warden, sounded like a husk of his former self. He brought news that should have been a triumph. Percy had submitted his transfer request to Briar Ridge Mental Hospital. He would be gone in a month. But a month was too long. We needed to act now. Hal's voice dropped as he spoke of his wife, Melinda. She was sinking, a chilling, antiquated term for the slow decoupling from life. Worse, her personality was fracturing. The sweet religious woman had begun swearing uncontrollably, spewing filth she shouldn't even know. It was as if the tumor wasn't just killing her, but corrupting her soul before the end. This detail is crucial. It suggests that the ailment was an invasion of darkness, something John Coffey, who expelled darkness as black insects, was uniquely equipped to fight. I made my decision. The system was broken. It allowed a monster like Percy to destroy a man and condemned a healer like Coffey to die. God helps those who help themselves, as the saying goes. I looked at Janice and admitted I was planning something dangerous. Her reaction was not fear, but interest. She trusted my moral compass, even when it pointed off the map. Chapter 9. I convened a war council. Brutal Dean and Harry came to my house for lunch. The domestic setting, cold beef sandwiches and iced tea, contrasted sharply with the radical conspiracy I was about to propose. I laid it out. John Coffey had healed my infection and resurrected Delacroix's crushed mouse. I believed he could save Melinda Moore's. The skepticism was immediate and rational. These were prison guards. They understood the consequences of escape and aiding a felon. Brutal, the pragmatist, voiced the fear that if we were caught, we would end up as inmates ourselves. Dean raised the darkest possibility. What if Coffey escaped and killed again? This was the spectre haunting us, the two dead Decay twins. This forced me to play my ace. I had to convince them not just of Coffey's power, but of his innocence. I told them about the shoe. The night before, when I handed my shoe to Coffey, he couldn't tie the laces. He didn't know how. This seemingly small detail dismantled the prosecution's theory. The killer had bribed the Decay's dog with sausages, then later wrapped his lunch back up with butcher's twine. A man who cannot tie a simple knot could not have secured that package. Furthermore, I explained the tracking dogs. The coon dogs had wanted to go upstream, away from where Coffey was found. They were tracking the true killer's scent, but the posse forced them toward Coffey. We were planning to break a man out of death row, yes, but for the first time we realized we weren't just risking our jobs for a miracle, we were doing it for an innocent man. The gravity of the situation settled over the table. Brutal Harry and Dean looked at me, and I saw the shift. The logic of the law had failed. The logic of the heart was taking over. They agreed. We would do it that very night. We would smuggle a giant out of the inescapable prison using Harry's truck. It was insanity, but it was the only righteous path left. Part 5, Chapter 1. Narrative time is a strange thing. Writing this memoir from the Georgia Pines nursing home, I feel like I have built a time machine. The past is vibrant, while the present smells of old age and antiseptic. Yesterday, I wrote until my hand cramped, reliving the horror of Delacroix's death. Today, I must dodge my own warden, Brad Dolan, an orderly who is the spiritual successor to Percy Wetmore. Dolan is nosy, cruel in petty ways, and suspicious of my walks to the old shed. He drives a rusted Chevy and reads nothing but trash, yet he holds power over me, just as we held power over the inmates. It is a bitter irony. But I have allies here too. Elaine Connolly, a fellow resident, covered for me this morning. She set off the fire alarm in the West Wing, smoking a cigarette she'd saved for years, just to create a diversion so I could slip away from Dolan's prying eyes. Even at the end of life, the dynamic of guards and prisoners, oppressors and conspirators plays out. We are always fighting for a little bit of freedom. Safe in the shed, I let the memories of 1932 wash over me again. I am back in the car, back in the planning, eating cold toast and preparing to commit a felony for the sake of grace. Chapter 2. Let us return to the evidence, for it is the foundation of our madness. The decision to move Coffey wasn't just based on faith. It was deduction. The lunch meat, the knots, the dogs. It all painted a picture of a man who stumbled upon a crime, not one who committed it. The prosecution argued that Coffey, a black drifter, was the only logical suspect. They ignored the fact that the killer snapped the dog's neck, a violent, precise act, while Coffey was gentle enough to handle a mouse with infinite care. They ignored the geography. Coffey was found miles away, weeping, trying to take it back. The white authority figures of the time heard a confession of murder, because that is what they expected to hear. They couldn't comprehend that he was trying to take back death itself. The realization that we were holding a saint in a cage rather than a monster changed the texture of the conspiracy. We weren't just helping Hal Moore's wife, we were validating John Coffey's existence. Dean asked the hard question again. Do you really believe that? And I did. The shoe was the key. A man who cannot tie a knot could not have bound the evidence. It was circumstantial to the law, perhaps, but definitive to us. Chapter 3. Before I left for the prison that night, Janice stopped me. She buttoned my coat, her hand steady where mine might have shaken. She asked one question. Can you really do something for her? She didn't ask about the risk or the danger. She focused on the mercy of the act. When I told her I thought we were Melinda's last chance, she practically pushed me out the door. Take it, she said. It was a benediction. In a world full of pain, if you have a chance to heal, you take it. Chapter 4. I clocked in at 6:20. The air in E Block still carried the phantom scent of the previous night's atrocity. The sensory details of the Green Mile are always heightened, the smell of floor wax, old damp and fear. The crew assembled, Brutal, Dean and Harry. We were tight, nervous, but masking it with professional routine. The wild card, as always, was Percy. We needed him there to spring the trap we had laid for him, but we also needed him neutralized. When he finally arrived, complaining about his car starter, the tension in the room spiked. We had to play a delicate game, treat him with enough normalcy not to raise suspicion, but prepare to take him down. I sent Percy to the storage room, isolating him. Then I walked the mile. I stopped at William Wharton's cell. Wild Bill was in a mood, manic and aggressive, sensing the electricity in the air. I played to his vanity, calling him kid, soothing his ego to keep him quiet. Manipulation is a guard's most essential tool. Finally, I reached John Coffey. He was sitting on his bunk, not sleeping, not crying. He was waiting. The connection between us had grown into something telepathic. As Brutal checked the locks, Coffey spoke, his voice rumbling like distant thunder in the quiet block. Sure, Coffey said, looking right at us. I'd like a ride. He knew. He hadn't been told a thing, yet he knew we were coming for him, and he knew where we were going. It was the final confirmation. We weren't breaking out a prisoner. We were being led by a guide. The Green Mile was no longer just a corridor to death. Tonight, it would be a road to potential salvation. Chapter 5. The atmosphere on the Green Mile is usually dictated by the slow, suffocating ticking of the clock, but on this particular night, the silence masked a desperate conspiracy. The plan hatched by Paul Edgecombe and his fellow guards was a fragile thing, built on the necessity of removing two significant obstacles: the erratic, violent prisoner William Wild Bill Wharton and the cruel, politically connected guard, Percy Wetmore. The evening began with a deceptive normalcy. The trustees made their rounds, and the guards engaged in the mundane theatre of prison life, playing cards and feigning indifference. But beneath the surface, the air was thick enough to carve. The first step involved sedating Wharton, a man who vibrated with a chaotic, malicious energy. Paul approached Wharton's cell not with a weapon, but with a peace offering, a soda laced with a heavy dose of sedative obtained from the infirmary. Here, we see the manipulation of vice. Wharton, despite his dangerous nature, was a creature of impulse. His suspicion was easily overridden by his greed for sugar. He drank the drugged concoction, unknowingly sealing his own fate for the night. It is a testament to the guards' desperation that they had to rely on the predictability of a psychopath's appetites to secure their own safety. With Wharton slated to lose consciousness, the focus shifted to Percy Wetmore. Percy, a man whose soul was a cocktail of cowardice and entitlement, was lured into a trap under the guise of a prank. The other guards, playing on Percy's insecurities and his desire for acceptance, or at least his fear of exclusion, cornered him in the duty office. They presented the straitjacket not as a tool of containment, but initially as a threat, which quickly escalated into a forcible restraint. The psychological dynamic here is potent. Percy, who had spent his tenure on the mile inflicting pain and humiliation on the powerless, suddenly found himself on the receiving end of physical dominance. As Brutal clamped the straitjacket onto him and taped his mouth shut, Percy was forced to confront a reality he had always avoided: that his political connections could not protect him from the immediate physical will of men pushed to their breaking point. They locked him in the restraint room, leaving him in the darkness to contemplate his cruelty toward the inmate Delacroix, though it was doubtful a soul as stunted as Percy's could truly learn from the experience. With the human obstacles neutralized, the team turned their attention to the supernatural center of their plan, John Coffey. When they released Coffey from his cell, the plan nearly disintegrated. As they escorted the giant past Wharton's cell, the drugged madman reached out and grabbed Coffey. In this moment, two opposing forces of nature collided: the chaotic, senseless evil of Wharton and the empathetic, healing sorrow of Coffey. Wharton, in his narcotic haze, recognized Coffey as a bad man, a projection of his own twisted psyche. Coffey, usually passive, reacted with a flash of terror and recognition. It was as if a circuit had been completed between them, a dangerous current of energy that threatened to derail everything. Only when brutal physically broke the contact did the tension snap, allowing Wharton to collapse into his drug-induced stupor and Coffey to return to his docile state. It is fascinating to note Coffey's perception here. He didn't view the escape as a jailbreak, but as a mission. When asked if he knew where he was going, he simply replied that he was going to help a lady. His clairvoyance, usually a source of pain, was now his compass. Chapter 6. The journey out of the block required passing through the execution chamber, a room dominated by Old Sparky. This scene serves as a grim reminder of the setting's true purpose. For the guards, the electric chair was a tool of their trade, a piece of furniture they respected and feared. But for John Coffey, it was a receiver of psychic agony. As they entered the room, Coffey balked. He stared at the chair with wide, terrified eyes, whispering that he could still hear the screams of the men who had died there, claiming that pieces of them were still trapped in the wood and leather. This offers a harrowing insight into Coffey's existence. He is a sensitive instrument in a world radiating pain. To him, the execution chamber was a cacophony of past suffering. He wasn't just afraid of the chair, he was physically assaulted by the spiritual residue of death. Paul had to physically block Coffey's view and snap him out of the trance, treating the giant like a frightened child to get him moving. They utilized the gurney, the very vehicle used to transport bodies away from the chair, to transport Coffey through the tunnel toward freedom. The irony is palpable. The device of death became their vessel of mercy. Emerging from the subterranean darkness of the prison tunnel into the cold night air marked a sensory shift. For the first time in what must have been years, John Coffey was under the open sky. As they sneaked past the guard towers and reached the hidden truck, Coffey's attention was entirely captivated by the stars. He ignored the danger, the guns and the tension, instead pointing out constellations with a rapturous, childlike joy. He identified Cassiopeia not by her Greek name, but as the lady in the rocking chair. This moment underscores the tragedy of John Coffey. He is a being of immense power and profound innocence, capable of seeing the beauty in the stars, while being condemned by a society that only sees his size and skin color. He inhaled the night air and the scent of dead leaves as if they were rare perfumes, grounding himself in the natural world before facing the supernatural task ahead. Chapter 7. The drive to Warden Hal Moore's home was a journey through the valley of the shadow of doubt. Paul Edgecombe, huddled in the back of the truck with Coffey, found his resolve crumbling. Removed from the immediate adrenaline of the escape, the weight of reality crashed down on him. He began to question his own sanity. Was he risking his career, his freedom, and the lives of his friends on a delusion? The skepticism that defines the rational mind began to war with the miraculous things he had witnessed. He reflected on the concept of the demon of discord, a philosophical idea that there is a chaotic force in the universe actively working to ruin the best-laid plans of decent people. As they arrived at the Moore's residence, It seemed this demon was indeed at work. The house was awake. Lights were flicking on. The element of surprise, crucial to their plan, was gone. When they stepped out of the truck, they were met not by a welcoming friend, but by a terrified and violent protector. Warden Hal Moores stood on his porch, brandishing a pistol, shaking with the stress of his wife's illness and the intrusion of convicts in the night. The situation was volatile. A single twitch of a nervous finger could have ended the night in bloodshed. However, the true horror was not the gun, but the voice screaming from the back bedroom. Melinda Moores, once a woman of dignity and kindness, was being puppeteered by the tumor in her brain. She shrieked profanities and sexual obscenities, her personality completely eroded by the disease. It was a shocking display of how biology can betray the soul, turning a loved one into a stranger. The de-escalation of this standoff was entirely due to John Coffey. While the guards froze, paralyzed by the complexity of the social and legal disaster they had created, Coffey moved with a singular, simple purpose. He walked past the gun, unbothered by the threat of violence. His presence acted as a dampener on the chaos. He gently disarmed the warden, not through force, but through a calming aura that seemed to nullify aggression. He wasn't there to fight. He was there to work. When he stated he came just to help, the truth of it resonated enough to shatter the warden's defenses. The group moved into the house, led by the condemned man, leaving the laws of the state behind to engage with the laws of the spirit. Chapter 8. The scene inside the bedroom was a portrait of devastation. Melinda Moores looked less like a human and more like a ruined vessel. The tumor had disfigured her face, causing a stroke-like droop, and her mind was firing random corrupted signals. She insulted Coffey with racial slurs and vulgar invitations, but Coffey remained unmoved. He didn't see the insults. He saw the pain generating them. This interaction reveals the mechanism of Coffey's gift. He approached the bed, and the madness in Melinda's eyes was briefly replaced by a lucid curiosity. She recognized him not as a threat, but as a fellow traveler in the dark. There was a dreamlike recognition between the healer and the dying woman. Coffey leaned in, placing his mouth over hers. This was not a romantic kiss, but a biological siphon. He began to inhale, acting as a human filtration system. The metaphysics of this moment were violent. The house itself reacted to the extraction of the evil residing in Melinda's brain. The floor shook, the grandfather clock stopped, and glass shattered. It suggests that the sickness was not merely a cluster of cancer cells, but a heavy negative entity that disrupted the physical world as it was uprooted. When Coffey pulled away, the transformation was instantaneous. Melinda's face smoothed, the grey pallor vanished, and colour returned to her cheeks. She was restored, but the cost was immediately transferred to Coffey. Unlike previous times where Coffey would vomit up a swarm of black insects that dissolved into the air, this time he choked. He fell to his knees, hacking and retching, but nothing came out. He turned grey and ash-like, absorbing the entirety of the malignancy into his own massive frame. He had taken the burden from her, but he could not release it. He was a sin-eater who had finally bitten off more than he could easily purge. The aftermath was a quiet scene of awe and exhaustion. The warden, witnessing his wife's impossible recovery, collapsed into tears, his skepticism obliterated by the miracle. Melinda, now fully herself, had no memory of her delirium, but felt a profound connection to the Negro man in the corner. In a poignant closing gesture, Melinda gave Coffey her St. Christopher medallion, the patron saint of travelers. She urged him to wear it for safety. Coffey, still sick and harboring the toxic energy of the tumor, accepted the gift. The irony is tragic. He is the protector of others, yet he is the one most in danger, carrying a lethal darkness inside him as they prepared to head back to the Green Mile. The miracle was complete, but the price was yet to be paid. Chapter 9. The journey back to Cold Mountain Penitentiary was a suffocating transition from the open air of freedom back into the stone embrace of the inevitable. Paul sat in the cab of the truck, the heater broken, shivering not just from the cold, but from the sheer existential weight of what they had just done. They had broken every rule of their profession, smuggling a condemned man out to perform a miracle, and now the adrenaline was beginning to curdle into dread. When the truck veered off the road, panic flared instantly, a testament to the frayed nerves of the conspirators. But it wasn't a mechanical failure, it was simply a biological necessity for Harry. Yet this mundane pause allowed for a moment of chilling observation. Brutal, standing in the darkness, voiced a grim prophecy about John Coffey. He would never sit in the electric chair. Brutal believed the sickness John had absorbed from Melinda Moores was too potent, a poison that would kill the giant before the state ever got the chance. It was a dark hope, perhaps, that nature might take its course and spare these guards the burden of executing a living saint. When they returned to the truck, they found John Coffey in a state of profound depletion. He wasn't just tired, he was spiritually hollowed out. The man who had inhaled a tumor to save a woman's life sat slumped against the cab, the very picture of a martyr whose battery was running dangerously low. This physical toll is crucial to understand. John acts as a filter for the world's pain, but unlike a machine, his capacity has limits. He was a vessel overflowing with a darkness that wasn't his own. The re-entry into the prison was an exercise in high-stakes stealth, a surreal mirror of their departure. They were centurions returning from a secret war, carrying their wounded healer. The physical struggle to get John down the tunnel and up the stairs highlighted his vulnerability. The giant was now as weak as a kitten, requiring the support of the very men whose job description was to kill him. It is a poignant inversion of roles, the captors becoming the caregivers, literally shouldering the weight of the condemned. They managed to get him back to his cell in Block E without alerting the rest of the prison. The relief was palpable, a frantic energy that made them giddy. They had pulled off the impossible. But the night wasn't over. The loose end of the evening, Percy Wetmore, was still waiting in the restraint room, bound in a straitjacket and gagged with tape. Paul's interrogation of Percy was a masterclass in controlled intimidation. They weren't just threatening him, they were dismantling his future. By leveraging Percy's greatest fear, not physical pain, but the exposure of his incompetence and the destruction of his precious reputation, Paul forced a stalemate. They offered a trade. Percy's silence for their silence regarding his breakdown. It was a fragile truce, built on the assumption that Percy possessed enough rational self-interest to cut his losses. But this assumption failed to account for the corrosive nature of humiliation. Percy was a man whose ego was his entire world. Damaging it was akin to a declaration of war. They released him from the straitjacket. Percy, sweaty and reeking of fear and urine, tried to maintain a facade of dignity, but the venom in his eyes told a different story. He agreed to the terms, but his compliance was a thin veneer over a seething desire for vengeance. As he adjusted his uniform and reclaimed his baton, he was already rewriting the narrative in his head, plotting a way to regain the upper hand. Percy stepped out onto the Green Mile, intending to march out and leave his shame behind. But he made a fatal error in geography. He walked too close to the cells. Part 6. Chapter 1. The narrative resumes not in the humidity of the Green Mile, but in the sterile, sun-drenched solitude of the Georgia Pines sunroom. Old Paul Edgecombe sits there, lost in the fugue state of memory, gripping his father's fountain pen until physical exhaustion finally claims him. There is a profound melancholy here, a sense of time slipping away as the past bleeds into the present. He writes of the miraculous healing of Melinda Moores and the terrifying journey back to the prison. But the effort leaves him slumped over his pages, sleeping the sleep of the ancient and weary. When he wakes, the morning sun is harsh. exposing the vulnerability of his age. He had hoped to avoid the resident bully, Brad Dolan, but fate, as it often does in Paul's life, has other plans. Dolan appears, and the psychological parallel is instantly struck. Dolan is the spiritual successor to Percy Wetmore. It is a chilling reminder that evil and petty cruelty do not die. They merely change faces across generations. Dolan harasses Paul, mocking his writing, his age, and physically hurting him by squeezing his arthritic wrist. It is a moment of helpless terror for Paul, who sees the ghost of Percy in Dolan's empty, grinning eyes. Just as the situation teeters toward violence, Elaine Connolly intervenes. She appears not as a frail old woman, but as a force of nature, her eyes blazing with a protective rage. She reveals a trump card that shatters Dolan's arrogance. Her grandson is the Speaker of the House. In this moment, the power dynamic flips. Dolan, like all bullies when confronted with genuine authority, crumbles. He retreats, leaving Paul shaken but safe. This interaction serves as a bridge between the two timelines. Paul is fighting monsters in the past and monsters in the present. He gives Elaine the pages to read, sharing the burden of his secret history, before steeling himself to write the final, agonizing leg of the journey. He must finish the story of John Coffey, no matter how much his soul protests. Chapter 2. We are pulled back to 1932, into the damp, subterranean tunnel beneath the prison. The journey back is a desperate struggle. John Coffey is no longer the upright giant. He is a broken vessel, grey-skinned and staggering, weighed down by the sickness he extracted from Melinda. The physical toll of the miracle is evident. He looks like a mountain eroded by eons of wind and rain. The guards, Paul, Brutal and Harry, are not just transporting a prisoner. They are carrying a saint who has just performed a resurrection. They managed to smuggle him back into E Block without raising the alarm. The tension is palpable as they navigate the silence, terrifyingly aware that one wrong noise could end their lives. When they finally get Coffey into his cell, he collapses, the St. Christopher medal hanging from his neck, a symbol of protection that feels tragically ironic given his fate. Now, the loose end remains. Percy Wetmore. They find him in the restraint room, sitting in his own filth, terrorized by the darkness and silence. The guards have crossed a line from which there is no return, and they must secure Percy's silence. Paul unleashes a verbal assault, threatening to expose Percy's incompetence, but he knows logic rarely works on the irrational. It is Brutal who steps in, delivering a threat so graphic and primal, promising a vengeance that would pursue Percy to the ends of the earth, that it penetrates Percy's arrogance. They release him from the straitjacket. Percy, attempting to regain a shred of dignity, smooths his hair and stalks out, vowing to make them pay. But as he walks up the Green Mile, a fatal error in geometry occurs. In his agitation, Percy walks too close to the cells. The reaction is instantaneous. John Coffey's arms, like striking serpents, shoot through the bars. He seizes Percy. This is not an act of simple violence. It is a supernatural transaction. Coffey pulls Percy against the bars, and despite Percy striking him with the hickory baton, Coffey does not flinch. He exhales the sickness, the black bugs, the concentrated misery and cancer he took from Melinda, directly into Percy's mouth and nose. It is a violation, a forced ingestion of pure malevolence. Coffey releases him, and Percy stumbles away, his eyes vacant, his mind essentially wiped clean. But the sequence is not over. Like a clockwork automaton programmed for one final task, the catatonic Percy draws his revolver. He does not turn on the guards. He walks to the cell of Wild Bill Wharton. Wharton, drugged and sleeping, never wakes as Percy empties the gun into him. The shots are deafening in the enclosed space. It is a brutal, swift execution, justice delivered by a broken instrument. As the guards rush forward, the final stage of the miracle manifests. Percy bends over and vomits a cloud of black miasma that turns dazzlingly white before vanishing. The evil has been purged, leaving Wharton dead and Percy a hollow shell. Coffey sits on his bunk, serene and restored, the sickness gone. He tells Paul that he punished the bad men. The guards are left standing in the gunpowder haze, realizing that the cosmic scales have been balanced, but at a terrifying cost. Chapter 3. The narrative shifts to the aftermath, a period defined by the heavy, suffocating weight of secrets. Paul recounts the clean-up to his wife Janice the next morning. The official story is constructed with the precision of desperate men. Percy simply snapped. The stress of the job, combined with his unstable nature, led to a psychotic break wherein he murdered a prisoner. It is a lie, but it is a lie built on the foundation of truth. Percy did snap, and he did kill Wharton. The supernatural elements, the healing, the transfer of disease, are omitted, buried alongside the physical evidence. Percy is shipped off to Briar Ridge, a mental institution where he will spend the rest of his empty days staring at walls, a living monument to John Coffey's justice. The irony is sharp. Percy used his connections to get the job, and now those same connections sweep him under the rug to avoid a political scandal for the governor. Back at the prison, the warden, Hal Moores, returns. He is a man walking through a fog of confusion. His wife is miraculously cured, yet his nephew Percy has committed murder. He suspects Paul and the others know more than they are saying, but he chooses willful ignorance. He asks Paul if the events are connected. Paul lies, offering a sanitized version of events to protect everyone. It is a compassionate deception. Paul sits with his wife, and she struggles to comprehend the violence of it. She asks the question that haunts Paul. Why did Coffey use Percy to kill Wharton? Wharton was a monster, certainly, but he hadn't directly harmed Coffey in the way Percy had. Coffey had called Wharton a bad man, a label he used sparingly. This triggers a detective's instinct in Paul. He realizes that Coffey's touch allows him to see the truth inside a person's soul. When Wharton grabbed Coffey's arm earlier that week, Coffey must have seen something, a specific blackened sin that demanded immediate execution. Paul realizes that to understand the execution, he must understand the victim. Chapter 4. The death warrant for John Coffey arrives, a bureaucratic inevitability that hangs over Paul like a shroud. The date is set, driven by a desperate need for answers, or perhaps a need to find a reason to stop the execution. Paul feigns illness and travels north to Purdham County. He is investigating the life of William Wild Bill Wharton. Paul digs through dusty records and speaks with the local sheriff. He discovers a history of escalation. Wharton wasn't just a thief, he was a sexual predator. He learns of an incident involving a 9-year-old girl, a crime for which Wharton was beaten but not imprisoned. The sheriff confirms that Wharton drifted through the state, a chaotic force of destruction. Paul then drives to Topingus County, the site of the Detterick twins' murder, the crime John Coffey is condemned for. He meets with Deputy McGee, a man haunted by the case. Slowly, the pieces of the puzzle lock into a horrifying picture. Paul learns that in the days leading up to the twins' death, a drifter had been hired to paint the Detterick's barn. This drifter ate dinner with the family, smiled at the children, and learned the layout of the house. The drifter gave his name as Will Bonney, the real name of Billy the Kid. The realization hits Paul with the force of a physical blow. Wharton had the tattoo of Billy the Kid on his arm. Wharton was the drifter. Wharton had been there, stalking the family, planning the abduction. It was Wharton who stole the girls from their porch, raped them, and killed them. John Coffey had merely found them, trying to use his gift to bring them back, just as he had with the mouse and Melinda Moores. Paul returns home, the weight of the truth crushing him. He collapses into his wife's arms, finally breaking down. The tragedy is absolute. He now possesses the terrible knowledge that he is scheduled to execute an innocent man, not just innocent, but a divine force of good, while the true killer, Wharton, has already been dispatched by Coffey's own hand. The legal system has failed, but cosmic justice has been served. Yet the machinery of the state demands Coffey's life, and Paul is the cog that must crush him. Chapter 5. The following day, Paul gathers his council of war, brutal Dean Harry and his wife Janice, around his kitchen table. The atmosphere is thick with despair. Paul lays out the evidence. He connects the dots: the Will Bonney alias, the opportunity, the history of predation. He explains that when Wharton grabbed Coffey's arm at the prison, Coffey saw it all. He saw the murder of the twins in Wharton's mind. That is why Coffey used Percy as a weapon. It was a retroactive execution for the murder of the Detterick sisters. The guards accept this truth with a grim resignation. They know intuitively that Paul is right, but knowing the truth and acting on it are different things in the 1930s South. They discuss the impossibility of a retrial. The sheriff in charge of the original case, Homer Cribus, is a bigot who cares more for a closed case than justice. A black man has been convicted, and that is enough for the county. Janice, however, refuses to accept this defeatism. She is the voice of moral outrage, cutting through their rationalizations. She demands they do something. She suggests an escape, a staged breakout. She pleads with them to save the man who saved Melinda. The men are forced to confront her with the cold, hard reality of their world. John Coffey is a gigantic black man with a limited mental capacity. If they let him go, he would be hunted down by dogs and men with shotguns within hours. There is no sanctuary for him in this time and place. To release him would simply be to subject him to a more violent, terror-filled death in the woods. The tension explodes. Janice, overwhelmed by the injustice and the perceived cowardice of the men, sweeps the lunch dishes onto the floor in a crash of china and silverware. It is a shocking display of violence from a gentlewoman, born of pure frustration. She calls them murderers. She accuses them of sacrificing a miracle to save their own skins. She storms out, leaving the men in a silence that screams with guilt. They clean up the broken dishes, but they cannot clean the stain on their consciences. They are trapped. The law, society, and circumstance have conspired to turn decent men into executioners of the divine. They know the truth, and that knowledge is not a key to freedom, but a heavy chain they must drag down the Green Mile. The decision is made by their inaction. John Coffey will die, and they will be the ones to kill him. Chapter 6. The weight of the impending execution sat heavy in the air of Paul's home, a stark contrast to the quiet domesticity of his night off. He sat in the living room, preferring the radio's audio landscape to the isolating glow of the television, watching the evening darkness swallow the sky. It is in these quiet moments that the psychological burden of the Green Mile becomes most palpable. The separation between the job of a death row guard and the sanctity of home life beginning to blur. Janice, ever perceptive, joined him. She didn't need words to understand the turmoil. She simply offered her presence. When she finally spoke, it wasn't to question him, but to apologize for calling him a coward previously. It was a moment of profound connection, reminding us that shared silence is often the loudest language in a marriage. Paul, haunted by the future, could only think of how beautiful she was, a memory he would cling to decades later in the sterile, cabbage-scented halls of the nursing home. When the conversation inevitably turned to John Coffey, the moral dilemma sharpened. Janice asked if Warden Moores could intervene. Paul explained that Moores had no influence over the situation. In a display of grim pragmatism, Janice insisted that Paul shouldn't burden the warden with the truth of John's innocence if it wouldn't change the outcome. She understood what Paul and his team had to do. They couldn't call in sick. They had to be there to ensure John's end was quick, unlike the botched horror that befell Delacroix. It was a mercy killing disguised as state justice. She urged Paul to talk to John to find out what the condemned man actually wanted, shifting the agency back to the prisoner in his final hours. Chapter 7. 2 days later, the absurdity of the legal system clashed with spiritual reality during the execution rehearsal. With John removed for a shower, the guards went through the motions with old Sparky. They refused to let the trustee, Toot Toot, sit in the chair this time. It felt like a sacrilege to mimic the death of a man they knew to be a miracle. Brutal sat in the chair instead, and as Paul recited the warrant, the air in the chamber grew heavy. Brutal, usually the rock of the team, was visibly shaken. He confessed to Paul in a hush that for the first time he felt in danger of hell. His reasoning cuts to the core of the story's theological horror. They were about to destroy a gift from God. Brutal agonized over how he would explain this to the Almighty, that killing a divine vessel was simply his job. It highlights the terrifying friction between human law and cosmic morality. Chapter 8. When Paul entered John's cell, the atmosphere shifted from dread to a strange, sterile calm. John smelled of fresh soap, clean as an infant, his eyes red-rimmed but peaceful. He seemed to exist on a different plane of acceptance. Paul, struggling to maintain his professional mask, asked about final arrangements. John requested a simple meal, meatloaf with gravy and mashed potatoes, and refused a preacher. He claimed he didn't need one, but in a touching reversal of roles, he asked if Paul would pray with him. As they held hands, the supernatural connection reasserted itself. Paul felt a surge of energy, similar to when John healed his infection, but this time it was uncontrolled, terrifying in its intensity. It was here that John Coffey delivered the most heartbreaking insight into his existence. He admitted he was ready to go. He described his life as being lonely, like a robin in the rain. But the true horror was the psychic noise. He told Paul that he heard and felt the world's pain constantly, describing it as pieces of glass in his head. John finally explained the mystery of the Decay twins, why they hadn't screamed. The killer, Wharton, had used their love against them, threatening to kill one if the other made a sound. He killed them with their love, John explained. This revelation offered Paul a grim form of absolution. By executing John, they were not just following orders. They were releasing a tortured soul from a world that was too cruel for such pure empathy. The execution became an act of mercy for the prisoner, even if it remained a sin for the executioners. Chapter 9. The night of November 20th arrived cold and dry. The atmosphere at the prison was brittle. Warden Moores was a wreck, shaking as he buttoned his coat, unable to stay for the execution. The irony was bitter. The man whose wife John had saved could not bear to watch John die, retreating to the warmth of his home, while John faced the cold dark. Paul felt a flash of genuine hatred toward the warden for this luxury of ignorance. In the cell, the final rituals played out. John handed over his St. Christopher medal to prevent it from burning into his skin during the electrocution, a visceral reminder of the violence to come. To comfort the guards, John claimed he had dreamed of Delacroix's mouse, Mr. Jingles, arriving in a Mouseville, where the dead twins were alive and happy. It was likely a gentle lie to ease the guards' guilt, showcasing John's enduring kindness. They knelt to pray. Paul asked for strength, but John surprisingly recited a simple child's prayer. Baby Jesus, meek and mild, pray for me, an orphan child. It underscored his innocence and the tragedy of a world that destroys what it cannot understand. Chapter 10. The walk down the Green Mile was attended by a sparse, hateful crowd, including the parents of the murdered girls. Their grief had curdled into a venomous rage, culminating in Marjorie Detterick screaming for John to die slow. The guards surrounded John, trying to shield him from the psychic assault of the hatred in the room, which John felt physically like bee stings. The process at the chair was mechanical and grotesque. The clamps had to be specially extended for John's massive frame, looking like alligator jaws. As he was strapped in, John apologized for what I am, a tragic summation of an existence defined by being different. Then came the moment of true horror. When Brutal produced the black silk mask, John panicked. For the first time, the gift of God was just a terrified man afraid of the dark. He begged not to be put in the dark. In a final act of defiance against protocol, Paul signaled for the mask to be left aside. He allowed John to die with his eyes open, sparing him that final terrifying blackness, despite the objections of the sheriff. The switch was thrown. The lights dimmed. The brutality of the electric chair is not glossed over. It is a violent, smoking end. John Coffey, a creature of light and healing, was extinguished by the cold mechanics of human justice. Chapter 11. The aftermath was a hollow silence. Paul went home as dawn broke, the world continuing as if nothing had happened. But the weight of the night crushed him on his back steps. He wept, not just for John, but for the collective failure of humanity. Janice found him there, and they sat together in the morning light. Paul couldn't tell her the full depth of the experience, but she understood enough. Time began its slow work of erosion, moving them away from the sharp edge of grief. But the memory of the electric chair remained, a permanent scar on the psyche. Chapter 12. The narrative shifts to the present day at the Georgia Pines nursing home. Paul, now an incredibly old man, finishes his manuscript for his friend Elaine. He reveals the impossible. He was 40 years old in 1932. He's now 104. The energy John Coffey had passed into him that day in the cell did more than heal a moment's pain. It had extended his life unnaturally, inoculating him against death. Paul takes Elaine to a dilapidated shed in the woods to reveal the final piece of the puzzle. Inside, living in a cigar box, is Mr. Jingles. The mouse, like Paul, has been touched by John's power and has survived decades beyond its natural span. But the mouse is ancient, grey and lame. Paul rolls a coloured spool across the floor. Mr. Jingles chases it with agonizing slowness, driven by the memory of old joy. It is a heartbreaking scene of endurance. But the sanctuary is violated by Brad Dolan, the nursing home attendant who serves as a modern echo of Percy Wetmore, cruel, stupid and malicious. Dolan mocks them, effectively shattering the fragile magic of the moment. Whether it was the exertion or the presence of malice, Mr. Jingles stops moving. The ancient mouse dies in Elaine's hand. Elaine, emboldened by the story she has just read, fiercely drives Dolan away, threatening his job. It is a small victory, but the loss is profound. Paul and Elaine bury the mouse in the fading light. The story concludes with a deep, existential melancholy. Paul realizes that the longevity granted by John is not a blessing, but a lingering sentence. He has outlived his wife, his friends, and now even the mouse. He is left to wonder if a mouse can live for over 60 years from a mere touch. How long will he, a human, have to walk his own green mile? The final thought is a desperate prayer for death, framing immortality not as a gift, but as a burden of endless loss. Chapter 13. The narrative shifts to 1956 Alabama, where the skies weep a relentless grey rain. Paul and Janice, now older, travel by bus, their mundane bickering about a camera shattered by sudden catastrophe. A blown tire hurls them into a fertilizer truck, tearing the vehicle apart in a fiery, twisted waltz. King brutally illustrates the fragility of existence here. In mere seconds, domestic normalcy turns to carnage. Paul, thrown clear and miraculously unscathed, finds Janice broken in the mud. In this moment of trauma, the veil between worlds thins. Beneath the dark underpass, Paul sees or manifests the weeping ghost of John Coffey. He begs the shadow for a miracle, for the healing touch that once saved a mouse. But the darkness remains silent. This silence confirms a terrifying psychological truth for Paul. The healing he received in 1932 was not merely a cure, but a sentence. Coffey had inoculated Paul with life, a vitality so potent it operates like a curse. While 73 others died or were maimed, Paul walked away with a single scratch. He realizes his unnatural longevity is a form of damnation, forcing him to outlive everyone he loves, from his wife to the mouse, Mr. Jingles. The divine force that flowed through Coffey creates a cruel paradox, where physical health ensures emotional torture. Paul is left to wander an endless green mile, haunted by the memory of the giant who healed him too well, understanding finally that sometimes God permits tragedy with indifferent silence. He lies in the dark, waiting for a death that refuses to come. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive, please subscribe to Horror Tales, where we dive into the lore of Stephen King novels and explore the darkest corners of fiction.